Okay. Welcome to my new channel. This is going to be, I'm trying to keep it an exclusively philosophical channel. Um, yeah, this is just the introductory video. It's going to be kind of long just because I like listening to my voice, but it's going to lay out pretty much what you'll expect to find here. Um, okay, so here we go. The channel is Five Red Apples. This is actually a name that I've used quite a bit online when I used to frequent philosophy forums, which I don't do anymore because they are a giant waste of time. But the channel name and my user ID for a lot of forums that I used to belong to is an allusion to Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Um, it's the phrase he uses, five red apples. It's one of the early sections. I don't remember if it's number one or two. Maybe it's three, but it's really early, where he uses this to demonstrate how language operates in specific contexts, right? In specific language games, as he calls them, to show how meaning is derived through use. Okay, I'm not going into too philosophical stuff. I'm just giving you the illusion of five red apples. Um, as I said, this channel is going to be philosophical almost exclusively in nature, if not exclusively. And some videos will be attempting to give like rigorous arguments, like pretty much like a full-on essay with explanations. And of course, I'll take questions and comments and or criticism, and I'll try to respond in kind, or I'll just try to respond. But some of them, some videos will just be my musings. Hopefully, I'm thinking I'll keep it somehow philosophically related, as loosely as that may be. But yeah, not rigorous stuff, but just like small conversations or talks about something that strikes my fancy, I guess. All right. So here is a list with commentary in parentheses of some of my interests. Well, most of my interests, I would say. But this doesn't mean that this channel will only exclusively talk about these things. I'm sure, like, always as I read or as I like get into some philosophical problem or debate, like new things like arise that like strike my interest or like I think are important, and then I'll try to like go into those things. Okay, but here we go. Here's the list. The first one is the longest one as far as commentary. The other ones are really brief, so just bear with me or just skip the video altogether. So Socrates. I don't really like, obviously we don't know too much about Socrates and we don't really know too much about what he thought other than what Plato gave us. But yeah, Socrates pretty much shapes my way of approaching learning in general or acquisition of knowledge or acquisition of philosophical theories or just the way I like my relationship to beliefs, which I'll kind of explain in a second. So let's go into a little bit of the background of Socrates. So, uh, famously, uh, when Socrates went to see the oracle at Delphi, the oracle told him that he was the wisest man in Athens, which kind of like surprised Socrates because he wasn't very scholarly on any really given field or any given topic. So in order to try to understand why the oracle had said this about him, which he kind of doubted, I guess, but I mean, he didn't doubt the oracle in one sense, but he wasn't like, he didn't know why the oracle had said it. So he began questioning those whom he naturally considered much wiser than he, the so-called expert in their fields. And he came to recognize that while he knew less than they did, like, yeah, like he didn't know how to build a home. He didn't know how to like make pottery. He didn't know details about these things. Like they knew a lot about their various subjects, but they also held other opinions. And these opinions were specious in his view, in his mind. Like they really held on to some opinions that they probably shouldn't have, and they had really no good justification for holding. And so he came to realize that it was his recognition of his own ignorance, contrary to the expert that he had like interviewed, let's say, uh, that this was where his wisdom lay, right? His awareness of his lack of knowledge, and right where else other people believe had false beliefs and they thought they were wise. Okay, so this is the legacy of Socrates, in my opinion. There's also the Socratic method, but to me, this attitude towards learning, towards uh yeah, beliefs, toward just your general attitude when you come to approach a subject, your understanding. This to me is Socrates' greatest legacy. Okay, as I say here. Okay, so I think so. In related to this, obviously, I think there's a great danger in having beliefs. When you have a belief, when you assent to the truth of any particular statement, then then that statement becomes less susceptible to your own doubt because you've already lent it, like you've already have the attitude that it's true, and that you have very good justification for believing it's true, and you might, but just having this as a belief, right, having that status, makes it makes you less likely to doubt that belief in the future, to criticize that belief, and then to reevaluate its status as so-called truth or truism, right? So that is the danger of beliefs, in my opinion. So if you can avoid beliefs, if you can avoid holding beliefs, which doesn't mean you don't like consider them as, let's say, the most likely uh, correct opinion to have on a certain subject. That's different than holding it as a belief. That's a whole different status. And I think with that status comes a certain attitude from us. And I think it's best to avoid this attitude. So believing that a statement is true is a dangerous attitude to have for a philosopher. So I try to ward off beliefs, swatting them away like flies, like Nietzsche in the marketplace, swatting off the people, trying to maintain ever ready to challenge them, undermine them, and reassess them. Right. And I think that's the correct attitude one should have towards beliefs. Obviously, some beliefs have more to say for themselves than others, and so you'll have more confidence in them. There's no problem. You can have a whole bunch of confidence, but I think just falling short of believing they're true is probably a good idea. Okay, so my rough definition of an intelligent person or a wise person, I think it's intelligent, but either way, you can flip-flop it kind of. Is not the one who knows more things than others, but it's the negative view. It's the one who believes fewer wrong things. Because I think if you believe fewer wrong things, obviously you have to know something. You have to start accumulating knowledge. But the one who knows fewer wrong things is less likely to be led astray, and is less likely to be led astray uh, regards to other things and other beliefs, and then just yeah, it's like you won't have false beliefs, you won't have strong attitude towards false beliefs, and you won't be like already on a tangent and like there's no way back for you because you're so entrenched in like in your way of thinking about certain things and certain beliefs, right? And like this again, this to me is anathema for philosophers. So Socrates basically shapes my approach to learning and understanding in general. I have no problem sitting down in a conversation full of people and they're delivering their political opinions, their economic opinions, their opinions on like education or even philosophy, and I can stay silent because I don't think like I have done my due diligence or I haven't been rigorous enough on the topic where I think I can start voicing like things with any kind of certainty. Now I have opinions, but like I'm very cognizant of the hierarchy in my opinions regarding the status as far as how sure I am of them. If I feel very confident, I'll say so. But if I'm offering something that is kind of tentative or I'm just kind of guessing or it's like some kind of a abduction or it's like the most obvious explanation, which doesn't necessarily mean the correct explanation, and that's the regard I'll have for my own let's say opinions or thoughts. without trying to call them beliefs. But sometimes, you have some beliefs. You can't escape having some beliefs. All right, so that is my general approach uh, to to learning, to understanding, and to just having opinions about how things are in the world. So Socrates, not philosophically per se, but this general attitude. Okay, next. Number two. Sorry, I need a drink because my throat is super dry. Yeah, nothing's better than water. Okay, Nietzsche. To me, Nietzsche, top three all-time philosopher. Um, yeah. So, and he was my gateway into philosophy. When I first got into philosophy, it was by reading Nietzsche, and Nietzsche was just, I was just fascinated by what he had to say, and especially like the kind of philosophy he did. As Nietzsche says himself, he philosophizes with a hammer, and that hammer smashed chains, like mental chains that I didn't even know I was wearing. Right. So he opened my eyes to a way of thinking, and like he basically showed how, or he basically argued, let's say, how like certain value systems had turned had turned like truth upside down in his opinion. And some of those value systems I had adopted as my own. So like I just took it for granted that like pity was a virtue and like a good thing. But the way Nietzsche explains it, like that you start to like reevaluate, like, wait, maybe pity isn't such a good thing. Maybe it isn't such a virtue. Um, anyway, so Nietzsche to me, yeah, he was just a beast and like a shockwave to my system. Um, and I'm glad that I came across Nietzsche first because these kinds of questions, like the kind of questions that we classify as continental versus the analytic tradition in philosophy, are really the most interesting uh, as far as like humanity and human beings and your self-development. But like questions in analytic philosophy, like what determines the referent of a demonstrative expression? Like, who cares? I mean, I care. I like this kind of question. It's interesting to me, but ultimately, for the world at large, who cares? Right? It's not important, like in that sense. So the continental questions I find intriguing, interesting, but I am an analytic philosopher. I was trained in an analytic school. I'm not a philosopher, professional philosopher. Let me just get that out of the way. I have a BA in philosophy. I did a little bit of MA work, but I dropped that. Well, more accurately, I got kicked out of the school because I had too many withdrawals. Not because I had any problem with my grades or anything. I was doing exceptionally well in my master's program, but just too many withdrawals, more than completed classes, so they booted me. I think it was somewhat political but anyway, that's another story. Never mind. So Nietzsche, like my top three, one of my top, he's in my top three all-time philosophers list. Um, yeah. So now, as I said, I did philosophy in an analytic school where you learned Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein. We also learned some GE more, but I don't put him in the big three as far as the history of analytic philosophy. So Gottlob Frege, he gets the analytic philosophy ball rolling, right? Um, big time, big time name in analytic philosophy in Western philosophy. Interest of mine. Right on his heels, Bertrand Russell. And his logicist program anchors the shift uh, of the linguistic turn in philosophy, which to me I still think is the biggest and most important shift in the history of philosophy. I think it's not as popular anymore, but to me, I still think it's the most important. Um, anyway, so Bertrand Russell, um, yeah, Birdie, as he was called, nicknamed, wrote a ton of stuff, and there's still plenty of good stuff to read by Russell, but um, yeah, his the stuff that he writes about in relation to what Frege had written about is the most interesting to me. Then there is my Ludwig Wittgenstein. Um, again, top three all-time philosophers in my opinion. Um, the third to me is Aristotle, by the way. So I have I have Aristotle, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein as the top three philosophers of all time, in my personal opinion, with my limited knowledge, and mostly all Western philosophy. Um, Reading Wittgenstein, just the depth and the rigor of thought was new to me, and thus it sets a new standard of what can be achieved in philosophy, what can be achieved by the human mind, how deep you can go when you start to think about philosophical problems. And once you see that, you're like you reassess how well you think you or like where you are on the spectrum of doing philosophy rigorously or well. So yeah, if I have one role model in philosophy, the one that I try to like do philosophy the way he does philosophy, it's Wittgenstein. Which doesn't mean I come close. It's just that's the target. Anyway, and 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 because I actually not I actually because I have an interest in the history of ideas in general, just the history of ideas. Of course, I have an interest in the history of analytic philosophy. It helps to trace the development of ideas within this field, and it gives me a better understanding. It helps me achieve a better understanding. So I think it's important. Um, okay, and in the history of philosophy, which I'll talk about a little bit later, depends how far you want to go back. Some people go all the way back to Aristotle, but I think like if you start off with British idealism, um, that will be a good entryway into the analytic tradition, or what we call now analytic philosophy. Okay, philosophy of language. Um, as I said, I think the linguistic turn in philosophy is still the most important event to happen in philosophy. Philosophy of language is my favorite subfield. I also think if I do, well, of all the work that I do, if I do philosophy of language, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, um, I think I am best at philosophy of language. But it, and I think for anybody doing philosophy to do to do some work in philosophy of language, I think this will sharpen your philosophical skills more than any other subfield in philosophy. Although generally you can improve doing any other kind of study, but I think philosophy of language has some of the more subtle difficulties, um, and so you really have to sharpen, I don't know, your mind or your perspectives to do it well. And again, I think a lot of, like Wittgenstein, not completely, I think a lot of philosophical problems stem from the misunderstanding of language, or stem from how language misleads you. Um, yeah, so philosophy language, hugely important. Huge, huge. Ethics, obviously, to me, I think is the most important field in philosophy because it's more important to how we are as human beings. It's more important to how we can develop as people. And so in that sense, it's more important. Like I said, the continental questions aren't like I think almost like inherently more interesting and more important for human beings. But right, ethics is also the least objective subfield in philosophy. So you get a room full of ethicists, and you're going to have all kinds of uh, differing opinions, and it's going to be really hard for anybody to like win over another person to his side of thinking, just because, yeah, ethics seems to be the most subjective, or one of the most subjective fields, and yeah, definitely one of the most contentious fields in philosophy. I have my own philosophical views or my own ethical views, which I think obviously are correct and better than everybody else's. But I'm not pretending that I have knockdown arguments or my views are like uh more cogent than anybody else's, although I think they should be. Okay, anyway, metaphysics, the mother of all philosophy, what there is in the world and what is it. The Greeks pretty much were interested in metaphysics and how to live a good life. And so, yeah, a lot of interesting problems in metaphysics. And they will like studying metaphysics, I think, is a good way to get into philosophy. Like, don't jump into epistemology. Definitely don't jump into ethics. Philosophy of language is not bad way to start. but I think metaphysics is like a solid way to get into philosophy. So if you're going to do philosophy, you're new to philosophy, take up some metaphysical problems, and I think it's going to be a good way to get your feet wet. All right, epistemology, how we know what we know. Um, so I put a Wittgenstein quote: "We make to ourselves a picture of the world, and in that picture, we set things in order. The first thing we must do is to make our picture of the world, and that is where we must start. We start somewhere." So, in other words, you're going to have to take some things for granted. Like otherwise, theoretically, radical skepticism is always available to you or to your like interlocutor or to your opponent in debate or whatever. You can always you can always undermine some statement or some premise by invoking the radical skeptic uh, argument or position that like you might be we might be dreaming all this and none of it could be true. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? How do you know this is not all a big dream? And there is no refuting that like in the sense that's going to satisfy people. So, but if we just take for granted that like right now you're not dreaming and you know you're not dreaming, like I think we're on solid ground and then we can just build off of these certain kinds of truths. Okay, so epistemology, interesting stuff. I mentioned British idealism before. Sorry, I need another drink. As a good segue into analytic philosophy, I also think British idealism like was not defeated by Russell, Frege, G.E. Moore, Wittgenstein. They have formidable views. Um, and while they're not as popular as they used to be, it would be really like I think I don't know what the word is, but to say that yeah, that they've been that the British idealist views have been refuted, right? I think they've been made less popular, and ultimately that's pretty damning sometimes. But if to study a little bit of British idealism, it'll give you a good entryway into what Russell and Moore were objecting to. Okay, the problem of universals. Speaking of metaphysics, and this is one problem in physics, the universal particularist debate. Um, the realism, anti-realist views. I am on the side of the particularists. Plato, Platonists are on the universalist side. So this is one problem that I mean, one philosophical problem that I have an interest in that I'm sure I'm going to do a video on, maybe a video series on. Okay, mentioning my ethical views, I am a moral particularist. Moral particularism, I think, is made. I think Jonathan Dancy is probably the biggest name in moral particularism. I have a couple of his books, but I already had formulated my view before I had even heard of Jonathan Dancy. Before I had even heard of moral particularism, I already hashed out my ethical views. And only later, after reading about what moral particularism was, I'm like, oh, this matches up with what I think. Right. So there's obviously there's different flavors of moral particularists. I don't agree with Jonathan Dancy eye to eye, nor do other moral particularists. But yeah, that's my view. I'm not going to go too deeply into it. This is just an intro. Living philosophers, I have to say that, and with a caveat, that John McDowell is my favorite living philosopher. And the caveat is that I tend to think I don't understand him all that well, which is kind of ironic, right? But anyway, what I do understand, I tend to agree with, and he just sounds very insightful. Um, but one, I don't do I don't have a depth of knowledge on any particular topic, not at the level that professional philosophers do. I mean, they do this for a living, they're professors, they get paid to do this. They spend their lives pretty much doing this. I am a hobbyist at philosophy. which isn't to say I'm not good at philosophy. I'm not saying I am good or not good. I'm just saying the fact that I do philosophy as a hobby only really reflects the fact that I don't go deeply into topics. So I don't have like when it comes to the literature on a certain philosophical problem, I have not read the literature. I've read some, but not to the degree that professional philosophers have done. So at some point I get lost. I get lost. Things start to go over my head because I don't know what they're talking about anymore. Not that what they're talking about is too difficult to grasp, or I wouldn't be able to follow it if I had pursued the readings or if I stuck to the topic. I just don't. So at some point, John McDowell loses me. But before he does, there's a lot that I do understand, and I am generally in agreement with what he's saying. But he's a horrible writer, like terrible, terrible. He just the way, it just his way of expressing himself. I don't think I don't think he needs to be so bad at writing, right? But he just is. On the opposite spectrum, take a philosopher like Jaguar Kim. Jaguar Kim is a beautiful writer, clear writer. Like if you want to get into analytic philosophy, pick up a book by Jaguar Kim. Right. It's just going to benefit you more to understand what someone says clearly, even though he might be like a lesser philosopher than someone like John McDowell, than trying to pick up a book by John McDowell and understand the stuff that he's writing and the way he formulates his sentences. Anyway, a little bit of shade towards John McDowell. David Kaplan. David Kaplan was once a professor of mine. Name drop. I took a couple of classes with Kaplan. I dropped one of them at the midterm because I didn't feel like I could write the midterm that I had in mind of writing. Like I was doing the midterm, and as I was almost finished with my essay, it dawned on me that I was not satisfied with my conclusions, that my arguments weren't as cogent to me as I thought they should be. And it led me to a different perspective on the question. And I took this to Kaplan. I said, I think I need to, I'm going to change, I want to change my midterm answer, but I only have like a day or two to write it. I might not get it done. And he's like, explain to me your ideas. And then I did, and he's like, okay, good, good, good. Write that paper. But I couldn't do it, so I dropped the class. His other class I finished, right? His other class I finished, and I did exceptionally well in that class, as good as anybody can do grade-wise in that class. So I was very pleased. Uh, yeah, so David Kaplan, and I like the things he writes about. I'm not just putting his name there so I can name drop his name, but I like philosophy of language. He does philosophy of language. He does logic and this my kind of stuff. Okay, finally, musings. I'll put this last here. Just like some stuff that I don't intend to do like super rigorous work, but I have some commentary and I have some things to say. And maybe it'll just be introductory stuff. Like maybe that's the level that I'll leave it off at. So one, Aristotle. Like I said, top three all-time philosopher. His astounding breadth of knowledge and like the like just how long some of his beliefs held up before they were like overturned or became unpopular is just amazing, right? So Aristotle, better than Plato. If you think your Plato was better than Aristotle, I don't know what to tell you. You're wrong. Um, but I'm not an Aristotle student, really. Like I know some about Aristotle. Obviously, not obviously, but I know his Nicomachean Ethics. Mm, I took I took a class in when I was at UCLA. That's what David Kaplan taught. Um, and I did poorly. Like I was just not into Aristotle, and I couldn't like I don't know if it was just that particular quarter, but I couldn't do any serious study, and like I barely got out of that class. I think I got like a B minus in the class, and I was happy to get it. And yeah, which is not good actually. Like a B plus is an average grade at UCLA. 3.3 is like the average GPA, which is just average. You're not standing out. If you're a B plus student, you are not standing out. Maybe you're standing out as subpar of anything, right? So anyway, so Aristotle. Next, symbolic logic. I have a thing about symbolic logic. I think symbolic logic is overused in philosophy today. And not only that, I think that symbolic logic, and this is not my own, my personal, just my own personal objection. It's a common objection made by other philosophers. That symbolic logic is a formalized logic, but that doesn't capture the robustness of natural languages. And so it doesn't, and so connected to thought, natural language connected to thought, if you think there is or not, but like, that it doesn't, it's not nuanced enough, or it's too formalized to capture the nuances of our thought. So that as much as useful as symbolic logic is, especially in the math and sciences, like in the other fields of philosophy where like you see it everywhere, I think it doesn't even belong. Like you shouldn't even have it. Not like it doesn't belong, but I think it's like you could do better without it. You if you just took the time to write papers without the symbolic logic, your paper would be better. You would be clear and you would probably come to a better understanding of what you're talking about. But its ubiquitousness is like to me just annoying. Okay, another similar in a similar vein, possible world semantics, like David Lewis, where he argued that like for possibilism, that possible worlds is not just an abstract, it's not just some abstract entity, but that they have their own reality. Uh, and again, possible world semantics to explain certain modal statements, to explain, yeah, hypothetical statements. Like, I am not a fan. I am not a fan of possible world semantics. So, well, as in the way that David Lewis advocated for them, or as a possibilism, as a version of possibilism. I am more on the actualist side, um, but more details on that later. Okay, how I do philosophy? So obviously, I have my own way of doing philosophy. It's not going to be too different for most people who do philosophy. Um, but I thought that I could do a video on like, yeah, how you should do philosophy. It's gonna be a little tough because that's a pretty broad statement. But maybe I'll just pick a philosophical problem, go through the steps of what I do, and then you can kind of just see like what goes into my doing philosophy. And you can judge for yourselves if I do it well or not. If you're able to judge, by the way, um, let me get on my soapbox a little bit here. In the logic book by Kalis and Montague, they have a famous saying that uh, it is the logician's job to judge arguments. So if you are a good logician, you will be a good judge of arguments. You will know which one is a strong argument, which one is a weak argument. You'll know which kind of evidence has more speaking for it than other kind of evidence, right? So given arguments, you are the judge of which is the better argument. Um, and I think this talent or this skill, let's say, is what most people lack. Or if they have it, we all have it to some degree. It's not at a very high level, right? So to become, you have to get to a certain level where you're able to judge arguments fairly accurately. And then you can weigh in accurately on whether this philosopher is right or this philosopher is right, or whether this argument is right or whether this argument is right, or on the particular strengths of parts of any argument. Only then, like, are you like able to judge? Like you are like an expert at judging arguments, and then your opinion has merit, right? Imagine me going to like a wine tasting, uh, me being a judge at a wine tasting. Like I know nothing about wines, right? Same thing about classical music. I know nothing about classical music. You can't ask me if this particular piece by Brahms or Beethoven or Chopin is better than the other. I have no opinions. No, I don't know I wouldn't even know how to base my opinion. I wouldn't know, like, so yeah. So my ignorance safely keeps me from making a fool of myself and giving judgments about Brahms, Chopin, and Beethoven. I forget who I said. Same thing with wines, right? And same, I think this applies to arguments for the vast majority of people, but most people are not that like humble, or they don't have this perspective or attitude. So they all think like, oh, this argument's better, and I can say, or this philosopher is better, and I can say, no, you cannot say. You cannot say. You are not good enough yet to judge arguments well. So you have no say worth really listening to. Okay. Um, the danger of categorizing. I talked about how I think philosophy of language is probably the most important like field in philosophy, and it's probably the most important for people to like to get good at, to hone their philosophical skills. Um, and I think in related, maybe it has to do with philosophy of mind a little bit, but there's an incredible danger in the way we classify the things that we experience in the world. And the way we classify things and categorize things is just it's a process of the mind, right? We take in a bunch of, let's say, sense data, and for us to think about it, for us to like we categorize it. It just makes it easier to process, let's say. But I think in doing that, we're losing a little bit of like, I don't know how to say this, like the reality of the situation, right? Classification is, the classification doesn't exist in reality. That's for our minds to help us process what we're seeing. And once you start to lose focus on that distinction, you might start to form opinions based on classifications, and or based on words that are really classification words, and you're going to misunderstand reality. Uh, okay, that's not very eloquent, but I'm much better when I write. Okay, so my Mount Rushmore, as you've already might have figured out, my Mount Rushmore. So Mount Rushmore has four presidents. My Mount Rushmore is Socrates, Wittgenstein, Aristotle, and Nietzsche. I put them in that order because it spells out swan. I was trying to think maybe that's my swan song, but my swan song doesn't make sense here. So anyway, Socrates, Wittgenstein, Aristotle, Nietzsche. So two Greeks and two Germans. Wittgenstein was German, or Wittgenstein was Austrian. I think maybe Austrian. No offense to Austrians, but he is my favorite. So whoever claims him, he is my favorite analytic. And Nietzsche is my favorite, like continentalist, and Socrates and Aristotle. Well, I've already spoken on them. So, okay. Another thing I might do in my musings are forgotten philosophers, like the worker bees, as I like to call them, of the philosophical world. These are unsung philosophers. They're not very well known. They might not even have been like super well known during their prime or during their time. Or maybe they were, but they've fallen off. Um, yeah, and they're not like someone like Collingwood, not well known. He was famous back in the day, but not well known now. Or someone like Michael Oakeshott, famous back in the day, but not read now. Even like Isaiah Berlin, if we can classify him as a philosopher, not I wouldn't, but anyway, but as someone like, this is the idea. People who were once famous, once renowned, and also people who were never that well renowned, but they've left us things to think about still. They've left some work that are still fruitful. And I put one example here, Joseph L. Kemp Jr. I knew nothing about this philosopher. I came across, I forget how I came across his name, come to think of it. And but I read one of his essays. I liked it. I thought it was interesting. And then I read his obituary. Um, I know he was married to a philosopher. I think she had a bigger name than he did. Uh, and and then I picked up his book, by the way. I picked up his book. Here it is. Let me hold on. It's right here. Bookmark sliding off. It's called Confusion, a study in the theory of knowledge. Now, the title confusion would have never appealed to me. Like, I don't care about this topic, confusion. Like, it's meaningless to me. But the subtitle, A Study in the Theory of Knowledge, obviously is strict analytic philosophy stuff. And since I like epistemology, yeah, I picked up his book, which I'm planning on reading and picking out maybe at least one essay which I find intriguing. And then maybe if he has like if he has a certain perspective that I find also appealing that applies to multiple topics, and then hopefully I will glean that from the book and then present it to you. But his main titles here are Material Falsity, Thinking One Thing is Another. That's the confusion part. And then a little history. Then the second chapter major title is What Confusion Is, A Little Logic, Truth Valuing, and A Logic for Confusion. Oh, sorry, more. Curing Confusion and Flexible Sameness. Okay, so a lot of these titles are definitely analytic philosophy stuff. Um, so I will be doing a video on Joseph L. Camp Jr.'s thought, and I will also be reading his obituary, which I thought was touching. And then another view of mine is that writing, and this is not my own view, this is a long time view. Someone like Bertrand Russell thought this, that writing is requisite for serious thought, which includes philosophical thought. Requisite. That means you cannot say, I have been thinking seriously about this topic, and these are my views. I want to tell them to you. It's like, did you write them down? Did you articulate them on paper? No. Then you have not done any serious thought, right? Serious thought requires writing. Writing is the only way to achieve serious thought. How can I rephrase this for you to hope it makes sense? Okay. So if you're a philosopher or would-be philosopher and you have lots of ideas and you're like super excited about them and you think, oh, you're onto something, that's not enough. You got to write it down. You got to write it down, give your full argument, explain everything. And if you're any good at philosophy, if you have any ability to judge arguments, once you put it on paper, you will take a second look at it. Trust me. And you're like, wait, this doesn't sound as convincing now on paper as I thought it was in my head. Right. And if you can do that, well, then you have some ability, right? And you'll rewrite it and you'll rephrase things, you'll excise some things, you'll add some things, and then when you're done, you'll reassess just how in love you are with this idea you had and with the argument you've been able to present. Um, and the closer you get to being somewhat objective about your judgments, especially your own arguments, the better chance you have of becoming a good philosopher, or at least very respectable philosopher. Okay, that's it. Those are the things. Now, for this one video, let me go into a little bit about my idea of becoming good at philosophy. I have a particular, it's not a unique take, but I thought I would just add to this video by having one musing here. The musing about becoming good at philosophy. Okay, so in my experience, and I wrote this down because I don't want to miss stuff. And I have terrible memory. So in my experience, the vast majority of people, including philosophy professors, so obviously including philosophy students, I don't care where you attend, I don't care if you're at Cal State Long Beach, I don't care if you're at a city college, I don't care if you're at UCLA, I don't care if you're at Princeton or Yale or Rutgers or New York. I don't care. You are not exceptional because you go there. They will never do good philosophy. You will just never do quality work in philosophy. And I think because I think that doing philosophy, like good philosophy, requires asking certain questions that the vast majority of mankind would never think to ask, and questions that which can lead to profound answers if pursued competently. And I think it's not that hard to pursue them competently. I think, yeah, what's hard is to come up with these questions, these certain questions, as I'll get into now. So. Now, once these certain questions get asked, generally by those who are good at philosophy, I think it's relatively easy, not easy, but relatively easy work to answer those questions. In other words, to come up with theories that address the problems the questions highlight. So I think even good undergraduates can come up with ingenious theories in response to such questions. The trick, however, isn't coming up with these questions, the questions that the vast majority of mankind cannot come up with, right? Or has not come up with. So let me use the a dreaded cliche. I hate cliches, but like sometimes they're helpful. Okay, here we go. Let's say that the vast majority of mankind will ask certain questions when confronted with a particular philosophical problem. The questions that are like meant to get at what exactly is the problem. Let's place all these questions into a box. Now, to make progress on our problem, we have to learn to think outside this box because these questions that we're asking have gotten us basically to where we are and not further. But so how does one think outside this box? If the majority of mankind, the vast majority of mankind asks these questions, how do you ask a question that the vast majority of mankind couldn't think to ask? And then how can we teach someone to think outside this box? So, as we are left wanting for answers to these last two questions, it's easy to understand why many philosophers believe, as I do, that to do philosophy at a high level, you have to already have some ability, maybe call it talent, or maybe call it an innate ability. An ability which they do not think, the philosopher professors, they can impart to you or imbue you with or teach you, right? They can help you improve as a philosopher, maybe make you a pretty good at philosophy, but you probably stand no chance of reaching philosophy's loftiest heights unless you're already one of the few who can think outside the box. Now, however, once in a while, some of us might do good work. If you ask enough questions, you might land on an important question. And if you pursue this question competently, again, which isn't all that hard to do, you might produce quality work. And this, I think, is how the vast majority of us can contribute to philosophy, right? So we are the worker bees. We are not the geniuses in the history of the world and the thousands of billions of people who have existed. We are not among the 0.0001%, right? And so to do the kind of work that Wittgenstein did, to do the kind of work that Nietzsche did, to do the kind of work that Aristotle did, like obviously it's going to be beyond our abilities. But it doesn't mean that we can't contribute and that we can't come up with some very like some good work, some gems, let's say. Uh, and and I think we should be satisfied with that. It's important work. We make progress, right? And then after we like let's say we clear the road, like 80% of the way we've cleared the path to the answer, some philosopher will come along like every like century or so and say, no, 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 no. There's something slightly wrong here. But he can only do that because he's looking at it from all the work we've already cleared. He's looking at the 20% that's still muddled, and he thinks he has a better way of understanding that muddleness. But if he had come when the road was fully like cluttered, it's not that he couldn't have done what we did. He could have, but would he have wasted his time? And would he have had that one insightful thought that he had when looking at it when the road was 80% cleared? Probably not. Probably not. So it was because of our work that he's able to use his talents precisely where like we'd want him to use his talents, right? You don't ask Michelangelo to sweep and clear debris, set primer, and just remove old furniture from this abandoned warehouse that we want him to paint. No, you hire laborers to do that. And then you let him come in when it's time for him when he all he has to do is pretty much paint. Right. It's not that he couldn't have done the laboring. Is that the word? Is that a word, laboring? But you don't want to use his energy, his time, and his talent for that kind of stuff. And so I'm not saying we're exactly laborers in philosophy, but maybe I am saying that, right? So we are the worker bees. It's the same metaphor. Okay, that's it. That's my musings on becoming good at philosophy. Um, I think like and from my experience from going to school, like let's say not let's say from going to school at UCLA to do my undergraduate work, from seeing very um precocious students, very hardworking students. I never belittle the effort and the work that students have done to get into universities like UCLA. And even when they're there, they generally they do a lot. They continue to work very hard, right? It's nothing to see students arriving at the library at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. It's nothing. And it's nothing for students to study, like some students, obviously, six hours a day. That's nothing. Um, so, but when it comes to certain fields, like if you don't already have some kind of talent, it's very unlikely that you'll be one of the better students in your field, right? Like think of musicians, like, musicians, if like these kids are like already like really, really good at the piano or really, really good at the violin, and they're like 5, 6, 7 years old. And if they want to become professional or concert pianists or violinists, like it's very rare that somebody had picked up the violin or the piano when they were 12 or 13 years old and then were able to be one of the best in the world at it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think this is roughly the same thing with philosophy. You have to have a certain ability. And otherwise, like, I think you're just going to plateau it. I think your ceiling is just set, right? But that ceiling is not low. Like, you can achieve and do good work. All right, I got enough on a tangent. I'll stop. Um, I'm not trying to say that I'm great at philosophy. Um, Again, I try not to make these kinds of statements. I'm not using my credentials or my background in philosophy to say I am good at philosophy. I think the only thing that speaks towards that are my essays, and I hope to present some of them to you. And if you are able, if you are one who's qualified to make judgments on it, I'm happy to receive criticism. That's what peer review is all about. It'll help you develop as a philosopher. You cannot foresee all the objections to your own stuff sometimes, so it's helpful. Other people's criticisms are usually helpful, even if it means you bolster your arguments and you have even stronger arguments for why you are right. Right? That's still helpful. That's still progress. But when somebody comes along and shows you you've made a mistake somewhere, you've erred somewhere, or you've gone astray somewhere, or you're not, or you're being unclear in some way, you're being vague, that's only beneficial to you. If it comes with a little bit of shame, if it comes with a little bit like eating crow, so be it. Right? Maybe you shouldn't have talked so much shit, but it's ultimately beneficial to you, and that's generally the way I take it. Unless you piss me off and just an asshole, then I will be an asshole back to you. But generally, I will be grateful. All right, that's it. I have this sleepy look. I'm not getting good sleep, so that's why I haven't been doing philosophy because philosophy requires all my energy. And some days I just don't have it. All right. Thank you for watching. Um, Miru Pavshim.